Hi, this is Elijah.
And this is Rob Javian, and welcome back to another interview.
We are interviewing Dr. Teresa Case today about John Henry.
Okay. So I've heard this before, but who was the warden of John Henry's prison?
Well, this is an interesting story, and so I'm going to back it up a little bit and tell you a little bit about how we think we know that John Henry was actually a convict laborer. And so this story relates really well to your project and to Burnham Wardwell, who is one of the figures you all discuss in your project. There's a historian named Scott Reynolds Nelson, and Scott Reynolds Nelson decided, and other people had tried to do this before, but they weren't able to do it. He tried to find the real John Henry. He asked the question, was this person just a myth? Was he a fable? Or did he exist? And he knew that this was a very important figure for so many people, particularly working men on the railroads and the mines and in prisons and in other places, but he didn't know, was this a real person? And so he goes back into the historical records. He's kind of a detective, a historical detective, and he looks at all of these different documents. I can tell you a little bit about how he came to this conclusion, but the conclusion that he came to was that John Henry was a young man and that he was a convict laborer and that he was leased out from the prison in Virginia, leased out to the railroad, and that he, along with hundreds of other convicts, died from basically overwork and exposure to toxic elements. And so he was exposed to terrible conditions, he and hundreds of other convicts, and died in that line of work, probably after beating a steam drill. So that's the story that he tells, and Burnham Wardwell comes into it because Burnham Wardwell was the warden at the prison that John Henry was sent to after he was basically convicted of burglary. And the historian's unclear whether John Henry actually committed this crime or not. It's difficult to know so many years later whether John Henry actually committed this crime or not. But one thing he does know is that the crime that he is convicted of is really a small crime. It's let's imagine that John Henry committed this crime for a moment. All it involves really is John Henry stealing what would be the equivalent of about $20 today from a store. But he's convicted. The sentence that he receives is very harsh. And we can talk about why that was and how that links up to your project more. But he was given an extremely harsh sentence of 10 years in prison. And as the historian says, and here's the book that, one of the books that he wrote about this, Ain't Nothing But a Man, My Quest to Find the Real John Henry. Nelson talks about how if one was sentenced to 10 years in prison, that this was kind of like a death sentence almost, because prison was very harsh. And it was even more harsh, or it became more harsh, because of the convict lease system. And Burnham Wardwell, at least in Virginia, was very important to the establishment of that system. Burnham Wardwell was, in many ways, a person we would call a good man. He was a very devout person religiously. He was a Quaker. He believed in it, very rare in those days for a white person in the 19th century. He believed in equal rights. He was very egalitarian. He favored voting rights for African Americans in the wake of the Civil War. And so he had a lot of things that were about him that we would say were admirable kind of qualities for especially for the time period that he lived in. But when he was named warden of the prison where John Henry was sent to, and when Wardwell arrived there, he was struck by how terrible the conditions were. That not the physical conditions, so that people, there was disease, and the bedding was just filled with lice, and then also people were treated quite brutally. There were all kinds of practices that they used against the prisoners that were torturous, really. And so Wardwell said, we don't want to do this. We don't want to run a prison this way. You can't people can't redeem themselves under these conditions, and it's a terrible situation. And so he went to convict leasing because he thought that if the prison was allowed to make some money through convict leasing, that money could be used to improve conditions, that it would pay for a better situation. And also he thought it would be good for the prisoners to be out in the air instead of cooped up in the prison. And he thought, but he did do his due diligence. He did go out and try to figure out, are the other situations with convict leasing that he knew were, there, how was that working out? And so he actually went and visited a convict labor camp elsewhere, I can't remember where it was, to see, well, what are the conditions like? And he found in that particular situation that people were fed well, that it seemed to be a good, humane situation, as humane as a prison life could be. And so he went back to his prison and instituted this convict lease system. And that's the lease system that kind of sweeps up John Henry and hundreds of other men, and most of them African American men. It sweeps them up and just really kind of chews them up. So there is this contest with the steam drill, the historian thinks, but in the end, John Henry perishes, as many convict laborers did, because there wasn't any value placed on his life. There's a book about the convict lease system called One Dies, Get Another. And that was kind of the logic behind it. Nobody cared about convicts. Their families cared about them. But many people in the society didn't care about them. They just sort of said, well, they committed a crime, so just put them away, and so the exploitation of convict laborers was not something that many people raised their voices against. Burnham Wardwell did take a stand in trying to improve the prison conditions. He instituted convict leasing, and then maybe about a decade later, he had already left, and he kind of realized what sort of system he had unleashed in a way. And certain things changed in Virginia that made that whole system a whole lot more exploitative than it had been when he was warden. And so he leaves, and maybe about a decade later, he realizes sort of what the system had become, and he renounces it and regrets that he had ever had anything to do with it. So it's a very sad story, and it's a very sad story and tragic story that John Henry and so many other convict laborers were really murdered. I mean, that's a strong word, but that's what happened. Because in John Henry's case, the historian thinks that, if we give his specific example, the man who was driving the convicts to labor, the boss man, knew that in sending convicts into the tunnels to do their work, that it was bringing up what the free miners had called bad air. They tried to send free miners in there, people who were freeborn. They were not prison labor. They tried to send those guys in there, but those guys could strike. And they went on strike, and they said, we don't want to work in these conditions. You have to wet down the walls. You have to take other kinds of precautions so that we are not breathing in toxic air. And they quit in droves. And so they could not force free laborers into that situation, but they could force convicts. Because, nobody in the society was looking out for them. Convicts couldn't strike, right? They could not resist. And so they forced John Henry and those other convicts into those tunnels to tunnel through and to breathe in those microscopic particles that essentially, within the matter of months, their lungs and their bodies just stopped working and they expired. And so there is a piece of the song that's often sung about I can't remember the lyrics exactly, but it involves John Henry buried in the sand near the White House. And one of the things that the historian found he didn't know where the White House was. He thought, a lot of people thought, do they mean the White House like where the president lives? But the White House where the president lives was not named the White House until like 1900 or something like that. And John Henry was, in the 1870s. So it wasn't that White House. But he found a postcard on the internet of the Virginia Penitentiary. And you know how sometimes people will say, don't look on the internet, there's not good information there. Well, in this case, they're wrong because he found this postcard of the Virginia Penitentiary, and that penitentiary he remembered that there had been a news story that there was a mass burial ground there by that penitentiary. They had been doing just excavation and construction, and they found hundreds of bodies in a mass grave. Not people who'd been buried, and there were, what are those called? Stones.
Caskets?
Yes, caskets. There were no caskets. There were tombstones. There were no tombstones. It was a mass grave of hundreds of, I think about 300 people buried there, and the scientists there said that they were mainly African Americans and that they had prisoners' goods buried with them. And so that's where they think John Henry was buried, because and he has different kinds of evidence that he brings to bear to make that argument. But that was kind of the point of his part of his story, is that they brought these hundreds of people in over time, actually not a very long period of time, to bury them in the sand by the White House, the Virginia Penitentiary, after they had been used, overworked, and essentially murdered. Because the bosses knew that in sending them into those tunnels, that was a death sentence, that those men would die, and they would die, basically trying to catch their breaths of suffocation, because all of that dust and all those particles were in their lungs. And so it's a very sad story. But I would say that your project, if I may, is very important, because it's important in history to look at the good. It's also important to look squarely at what is ugly, because if we can see that and understand that in history, we can kind of look at our own times and recognize, well, what is good about our society and what is ugly, what can we change, and particularly things that are ugly that are kind of hidden away that most people might not kind of notice. And we have to kind of bring it out and try to understand it and try to resolve it. Now, a good question, and I used to assign one of these books in my classes, a lot of times the students would say, but John Henry is such a common name. I mean, there must be thousands and thousands of John Henrys, right? But one of the things he points out in a paper he gave was that there really weren't very many John Henrys before there was John Henry. In other words, once you have John Henry and he becomes famous, then you have a lot of people naming their sons John Henry this, or different forms of, they're naming it in remembrance of John Henry. They're naming their child in remembrance of John Henry. But at the time in the 1870s when John Henry lived, the historian is saying there weren't very many John Henrys. It was not a common name. And so he has different kinds of evidence. He has the penitentiary records, which name a John Henry. He has court records that he's gone back to. And he's got the records of the convict leasing system itself. So he has quite a bit that he's relied on. I would say, one thing about history is, let's say he's wrong and he doesn't have the right person, Suppose that the person he's found in those records, John Henry, is not the real John Henry of myth, of lore. He still has told us a very important story about our history. So even if he's got the wrong guy, because he wrote that book and went down these avenues, went down these pathways and explored all of this, again, the good, the bad, and the ugly, he has, in doing that, we have a much better understanding of Southern history, U.S. history, I think. So
That that is all our time that we have today. Thank you very much. This has been very informational. I really appreciate it. And just thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Rob Javian. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much.